in the dense forests of Belarus, as Nazi forces swept through Eastern Europe leaving devastation in their wake, one man turned the wilderness into a sanctuary. Tuvia Bielski, a former soldier and unlikely commander, defied annihilation by building a hidden village, a secret world of survival, resistance, and hope amidst the darkness of war. In the early 1940s, as the German invasion of the Soviet Union unleashed one of the most brutal fronts of the Second World War, the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe faced an unimaginable fate. Entire villages were wiped out within days, families were torn apart, and centuries of Jewish life in Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus vanished in the shadow of the Nazi occupation. Among those who refused to accept this extermination without resistance was a man named Tuvia Bielski, a former soldier of the Polish army, born in the small Belarusian village of Stankiewicz. He was one of 12 brothers, sons of a humble miller, raised in a world that would soon be engulfed by war. When the German forces swept into Belarus in the summer of 1941, the region's Jewish population quickly became targets of systematic slaughter. Einsatzgruppen units, local collaborators, and police battalions carried out mass shootings, burning synagogues, and forcing survivors into newly established ghettos. Among the first victims were members of the Bielski family. Several of Tuvia's relatives were executed in the Novogrudok ghetto, while others were captured or fled into the forests. It was in these forests, dense and sprawling across the Belarusian landscape, that Tuvia and his brothers, Assail, Zus, and Aaron, would make a fateful decision that changed the course of more than 1,000 lives. The Bielskis had grown up knowing the terrain intimately, the thick woods, the swamps, and the hidden trails that cut through the countryside had always been part of their lives. When the Nazi terror reached their doorstep, they turned that knowledge into a weapon of survival. At first, they were only a handful: Tuvia, Assail, Zus, and young Aaron. They had few weapons, little food, and no organized plan. But as refugees began to trickle into the forest, men, women, and children escaping from the ghettos, Tuvia realized that their mission could not simply be about staying alive. It had to be about saving as many others as possible. The early months were harsh. The partisans had to move constantly to buy German patrols and local collaborators. They survived on whatever they could find: potatoes stolen from nearby farms, berries, small game, and the occasional aid from sympathetic peasants. Winter came early in Belarus that year, and the forest turned from a refuge into a frozen tomb for many who lacked shelter or proper clothing. Yet even in these brutal conditions, the Bielskis refused to turn anyone away. When new groups of Jews appeared, frightened and starving, Tuvia would tell them, "Whoever is Jewish, come to us. We will protect you." It became the foundation of his leadership, a commitment to human life above all else. As their numbers grew, so did their challenges. Feeding dozens of mouths in the forest required organization and discipline. Assail, the second eldest, took charge of logistics and building shelters, while Zus, known for his fierce temper and bravery, led small raiding parties to gather supplies and weapons. Tuvia remained the unifying figure, the one whose calm authority and sense of purpose held the group together. By 1942, the Bielski brothers had created a Funsen camp deep in the Naliboki forest. It was not just a hideout, it was a community. Word of the Bielskis camp spread quickly among the ghettos. Messengers were sent to bring news to those still imprisoned behind barbed wire, offering hope where there had been none. Many attempted to escape and join them, though not all succeeded. German forces intensified their hunts for Jews in hiding, sending reconnaissance units and collaborating police into the forests. Raids were frequent, and punishment was severe for anyone caught helping the partisans. Yet despite the danger, the number of people under Tuvia's protection continued to rise. By the spring of 1943, there were hundreds of men, women, and children living in what had come to be known as the Bielski Otriad, a partisan detachment unlike any other in the region. While other groups focused solely on sabotage and guerrilla warfare, Tuvia's unit had a dual mission to resist the enemy and to save lives. They built log huts, dug wells, and organized workshops. Tailors repaired clothing, blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, and carpenters built furniture. A small school was established for the children. There was even a makeshift synagogue, where those who had lost everything could still gather to pray. The camp became known as Jerusalem in the Forest. It was a place where the idea of Jewish community persisted despite the war raging around them. There were weddings, births, and songs sung at night by the campfires. Yet it was always shadowed by danger. The Germans, aware of growing partisan activity, launched frequent cleansing operations, large-scale sweeps designed to wipe out resistance fighters. These operations brought entire divisions into the forests, armed with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. In the summer of 1943, the Bielskis faced their greatest test. German and Lithuanian police units began Operation Hermann, one of the largest anti-partisan campaigns of the war. The forests of western Belarus erupted with gunfire as thousands of troops moved in to crush the resistance. Smoke from burning villages filled the air. Many partisan units were forced to scatter, and some were destroyed completely. The Bielskis, with over 700 civilians in their care, could not move quickly enough to flee. Tuvia ordered the group to divide into smaller units, taking only essential supplies, and to move through the swampy terrain that the Germans' heavy vehicles could not cross. For weeks, they wandered through the marshes, hungry and exhausted, evading enemy patrols by inches. By the time Operation Hermann ended, hundreds of Jews had been killed in the forest. But the Bielskis survived. Their ability to endure what should have been certain destruction became legendary among the local population. When they regrouped, Tuvia made a decision to rebuild, stronger than before. He declared that no matter what happened, they would not abandon their mission to save others. The camp was reconstructed in a new location, deeper in the forest, and this time it grew into a small, self-sustaining village. The new camp was organized with remarkable precision. At its peak, it had workshops producing everything from weapons to shoes. There was a bakery, a communal kitchen, a bathhouse, and even a theater where survivors performed plays to lift spirits. The people called it the Bielski camp, but to those who lived there, it was a symbol of defiance. While the Nazis sought to erase Jewish existence, the Bielskis created a society that refused to die. The partisans were not isolated from the broader war. They maintained contact with Soviet partisan commanders, often coordinating raids on German supply lines and communication posts. Bielski, in particular, gained a reputation for his boldness in combat, leading attacks that disrupted German transport routes and captured much-needed supplies. Assail became a trusted organizer within the Soviet partisan structure, ensuring that the Bielski group maintained political connections without losing its independence. Relations with Soviet partisans were not always smooth. Some viewed the Bielskis with suspicion, accusing them of prioritizing refugees over military action. But Tuvia stood firm. He argued that every life saved was a victory, and that rescuing Jews from the ghettos was itself a form of resistance. His determination often put him at odds with partisan commanders who valued combat efficiency over humanitarian missions, yet he never compromised. By late 1943, the Bielski camp housed more than 200 people, men, women, and children who would otherwise have perished. It was one of the largest rescue efforts of Jews by Jews during the Holocaust. The camp's daily life was organized with strict rules. Everyone had a role to play, from tending fires to guarding the perimeter. There were patrols that scouted the area for German movements, and there were underground bunkers for protection during air raids. Disease and hunger remained constant threats, but morale was sustained by the knowledge that survival itself was resistance. Tuvia's leadership became legendary within the partisan movement. To his followers, he was both a commander and a protector, a man who combined the discipline of a soldier with the compassion of a father. Yet leadership also carried heavy burdens. He was often forced to make difficult decisions: how to punish thieves, how to deal with deserters, how to ration scarce food. There were moments when the camp's survival hung by a thread, when dissent and fear threatened to unravel everything they had built. But through it all, Tuvia's resolve never wavered. As 1944 approached, the tide of war began to turn. The Red Army was advancing westward, pushing the German forces out of Soviet territory. In Belarus, the sound of artillery grew closer each week. The Partisans intensified their operations, attacking retreating German units and sabotaging railways. When Soviet troops finally reached the Naliboki forest in the summer of 1944, they were astonished to discover an entire community hidden among the trees. A settlement complete with workshops, schools, and hundreds of survivors who had endured the war beyond belief. For the Bielskis, liberation was bittersweet. Nazi Bielski was drafted into the Red Army soon after the Soviets took control of the region. He fought bravely but was killed in action before the end of the war. Zus and Tuvia eventually left Belarus and made their way to the west, first to displaced persons camps and later to Israel, and finally to the United States. Tuvia settled in New York, where he lived quietly, running a small trucking business. He rarely spoke about the war, but those who knew him said that his courage never faded. The legacy of the Bielski brothers endures as one of the most extraordinary stories of resistance and survival in modern history. While the Holocaust claimed 6 million Jewish lives, the Bielskis proved that defiance was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Their forest camp was not just a refuge. It was a declaration that Jewish life and dignity would not be erased. When historians later examined the records of the Soviet partisans, they confirmed the scale of the Bielskis' achievement. Over 200 people had survived under their protection, among them farmers, teachers, children, and the elderly. Some went on to build new lives in Israel and America, their descendants carrying forward the memory of the forest community that saved them. The remnants of the Bielski camp still exist today, hidden among the trees of modern-day Belarus. Visitors who walk through the site can still see traces of bunkers, wells, and fire pits, silent witnesses to a miracle of endurance. Each relic tells a story of ordinary people who, in the face of extermination, chose to live, to resist, and to rebuild. In the chaos of the Second World War, when the Nazi regime sought to extinguish an entire people, Tuvia Bielski and his brothers created a sanctuary of life. They fought not for conquest or glory, but for humanity itself. The forest that once owed with gunfire now stands as a monument to their courage, a living testament to the power of unity, faith, and the unbreakable will to survive. Even decades later, survivors remembered Tuvia's words, spoken during the darkest nights in the forest. "Our revenge is to live," and so they did. After the war ended, the survivors who had once called the forest their home began to scatter across the ruins of Eastern Europe. The liberation of Belarus by the Red Army brought freedom, but also uncertainty. Towns and villages lay in ashes, and the remnants of Jewish communities were almost entirely gone. For those who had lived in the Bielski camp, stepping out of the forest meant returning to a world that had been erased. Many discovered that their homes had been taken, their families murdered, and their traditions uprooted. The forest that had once been a place of fear had also been a refuge, and leaving it behind was, for some, like leaving the only world that still made sense. Tuvia and his brothers remained in Belarus for several months after liberation, assisting the Soviet authorities in identifying local collaborators who had participated in massacres and in organizing the transport of survivors. But the political atmosphere was changing rapidly. Soviet control was absolute, and the NKVD began to view independent partisan groups with suspicion. Anyone who had fought outside the formal Soviet command structure was questioned, sometimes imprisoned. The Bielskis had worked with Soviet partisans, but had always maintained autonomy, and that independence now made them targets of scrutiny. Tuvia understood that remaining in Belarus would not be safe for long. In late 1944, with the front lines pushing westward and Europe entering its final stage of conflict, the surviving Bielskis began planning their departure. Zis and Tuvia, along with a few trusted comrades, managed to secure travel papers and joined a stream of displaced persons moving through Poland. Asel's death in battle was a wound that followed them everywhere. He had been drafted into the Red Army's 1st Belarusian Front, fighting near East Prussia. In the winter of 1944, his unit was caught in heavy combat, and he never returned. For Tuvia, the loss of his brother was not only personal but symbolic, a reminder of how fragile survival remained even after the war's end. As the brothers moved westward through the war-torn countryside, they witnessed the full devastation of the European continent. Entire cities lay in ruins, bridges collapsed, and roads were filled with refugees, carrying what little they had left. The displaced persons camps established by the Allies in Poland and Germany became temporary homes for millions. Jews who had survived the ghettos, the concentration camps, and the forests gathered in these camps, forming new communities while waiting for a chance to rebuild their lives elsewhere. The Bielskis arrived at one such camp in 1945, settling first in Lublin and later in the American zone of occupation in Germany. There, the brothers began to reconnect with former members of their partisan group, who had also made their way out of Belarus. Some of those they had rescued came to thank them. Others simply sought the comfort of familiar faces. The camp became a place where stories of the forest were told and retold, each one a fragment of a larger memory. The nights of fear, the songs by the fires, the relentless struggle to survive. For Tuvia, however, the future lay beyond Europe. The war had destroyed everything that once defined his homeland. He dreamed of a place where his people could live without fear, and that dream pointed toward the emerging Jewish state in Palestine. But immigration to British-controlled Palestine was heavily restricted, and thousands of survivors were stranded in limbo. The Bielskis joined one of the illegal immigration movements, organized by Jewish resistance networks known as Bricha, which helped survivors escape from Europe and reach the Mediterranean. Their journey was perilous. Moving under false names, the Bielskis crossed into Czechoslovakia, then into Austria, avoiding checkpoints and border patrols. They traveled mostly at night, blending in with streams of displaced people still wandering through post-war Europe. By late 1946, they reached Italy, where Zionist organizations operated safe houses for Jewish refugees preparing to sail for Palestine. But British naval patrols often intercepted these ships, forcing many to wait in detention camps in Cyprus. During this time, Tuvia married Luka, a fellow survivor from the Novogrudok ghetto whom he had protected in the forest. Their bond, forged during the war, deepened in the aftermath of destruction. Together they made plans to leave Europe permanently. But when it became clear that legal immigration to Palestine might take years, they changed course. With assistance from American Jewish organizations, the Bielskis secured visas to the United States. In 1948, they arrived in New York City, where they began a new chapter of life far removed from the forests of Belarus. Life in America was quiet, almost anonymous. The man who had commanded over 1,000 people in the wilderness now lived in Brooklyn, driving trucks for a living. Tuvia and Lilka raised their children in modest surroundings, rarely speaking about their wartime experiences. Those who met him saw an unassuming man, with steady eyes and a calm demeanor, unaware that he had once defied one of the most powerful armies in history. For years, the story of the Bielski partisans remained largely unknown outside survivor circles. The Holocaust, though recognized as a global tragedy, was still a subject shrouded in silence during early 1960s. It was only decades later that researchers and historians began to uncover the full scope of the Bielskis' rescue operations. Soviet archives, long sealed, held reports on partisan activities in Belarus. Testimonies from survivors who had lived in the forest began to emerge, revealing the structure and scale of the camp. Scholars learned that the Bielskis group was one of the largest armed Jewish resistance formations in Nazi-occupied Europe. Unlike other partisan units, it had maintained a clear humanitarian focus. saving lives rather than seeking military victory. The Bielski partisans had operated across a wide swath of western Belarus, primarily in the Naliboki and Lipixany forests. Their ranks included not only civilians but also armed fighters who carried out sabotage missions against German supply lines. They destroyed bridges, ambushed convoys, and attacked police outposts. Soviet partisan command records confirmed that the Bielskis contributed significantly to the broader anti-Nazi resistance in the region. Yet their most remarkable achievement was the creation of a self-sustaining community capable of surviving for years behind enemy lines. As survivors resettled in Israel, the United States, and other countries, they carried with them memories of the forest life, the daily routines, the dangers, and the extraordinary resilience of those who refused to give up. Some became witnesses in post-war trials against Nazi collaborators, recounting how local police units had hunted Jews through the forests and burned villages suspected of aiding them. Their testimonies helped shape the historical record of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Tuvia and Zis continued to live in the United States. Zis, known for his fierce spirit and energy, also entered the trucking business, often working alongside his brother. They remained close for the rest of their lives, occasionally attending gatherings of Jewish veterans and partisan associations. For the most part, however, they avoided public attention. They had fought for survival, not fame. Their story might have remained a quiet legend among survivors, if not for the growing interest in Holocaust resistance movements during the late 20th century. In the 1980s, researchers, filmmakers, and journalists began to seek out members of the Bielski group. Survivors were interviewed in New York, Israel, and across Europe. They spoke of how the Bielskis had organized weddings, schools, and even medical care in the forest. They described the feeling of safety that came from knowing someone like Tuvia was leading them. These stories began to circulate in academic journals and documentaries, and soon the Bielski name became synonymous with the idea of organized Jewish resistance. When Tuvia Bielski died in 1987, his passing was quiet, but among those who remembered him, it marked the end of an era. His funeral was attended by family friends and a few of the people he had saved. Lilka stood beside his grave, holding their children's hands, as those who had once followed him through the forests of Belarus whispered prayers in his memory. Years later, when Lilka passed away, she was buried beside him. Their graves, modest and simple, became a place of pilgrimage for those who knew what they had done. As archives opened and testimonies were collected, historians pieced together the full picture of the Bielski operation. Between 1942 and 1944, the group had rescued and protected more than 200 Jews. The camp had functioned with a complex internal structure that mirrored a small village. There were leaders responsible for food distribution, defense, construction, and medical aid. Skilled craftsmen built everything from stoves to wagons, while others were assigned to scouting and communication tasks. Despite constant danger, the camp operated with remarkable efficiency. The logistical challenges were immense. Food was always scarce, and supplies often had to be taken from nearby farms, sometimes through raids that risked German retaliation. Maintaining secrecy was vital. The camp's location shifted several times to avoid discovery. Scouts were posted at key points along forest trails, ready to warn of approaching patrols. When German forces conducted sweeping operations, the entire camp could dismantle and move within hours, leaving almost no trace. The Bielski group's survival also depended on alliances with other partisan units. They exchanged information and occasionally coordinated attacks. Soviet commanders valued their local knowledge and their ability to navigate the terrain. The Bielskis, in turn, relied on the Soviets for ammunition and limited supplies. Yet they maintained their independence, a rare accomplishment in a region tightly controlled by Soviet partisan authorities. After the war, the impact of the Bielski brothers' efforts rippled through generations. Many of the children, who had been hidden in the forest, grew up to become doctors, teachers, engineers, and artists. They carried the memory of the forest village as a symbol of resilience. Some returned to Belarus years later to visit the site where they had once lived. The remains of bunkers and fire pits still marked the earth, overgrown by moss and roots. In the early 2000s, a memorial was erected near the site of the main camp, bearing the names of the Bielskis and honoring the partisans who had lived and died there. The story eventually reached global audiences through books and films that dramatized the events of the forest. One of the most well-known portrayals came in 2008 when the film A Defiancy, starring Daniel Craig as Tuvia Bielski, brought the story to millions around the world. Though dramatized for cinema, it reintroduced the legacy of the Bielskis to a new generation, reminding viewers that resistance during the Holocaust took many forms. Not all on battlefields or in cities, but also in hidden places where ordinary people refused to surrender their humanity. Yet beyond the recognition, the essence of the story remained deeply personal. Those who had lived under Tuvia's protection often described him not as a military hero, but as a man who gave them a chance to live. Many remembered his voice in the darkness of the forest, steady and commanding, telling them to stay calm when fear threatened to break them. His decisions, when to move, when to fight, when to hide, had meant the difference between life and death for hundreds. The post-war years were not easy for any of the Bielskis. The trauma of what they had witnessed lingered, often unspoken. Like many survivors, they carried invisible scars. But they built families, businesses, and new lives far from the scenes of horror. Their children grew up hearing fragments of their past, sometimes only later realizing the scale of what their parents had endured. In later decades, as Holocaust education became central to preserving history, the Bielski story was included in school curricula, museum exhibits, and research projects. Scholars highlighted how their camp defied the assumption that Jewish resistance was limited to armed revolts in ghettos or concentration camps. The Bielskis had created something different, a living, breathing community that fought the Nazis simply by surviving. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Belarus had begun to acknowledge its partisan history more openly. Monuments to the wartime resistance were erected across the country, though political narratives often emphasized Soviet heroism over Jewish suffering. Still, the memory of the Bielskis persisted in local folklore. Villagers who had once supplied them with food or information passed down stories of the forest Jews, who had built their own town in defiance of the Nazis. Today, the site of the Bielski camp remains a place of quiet remembrance. The forest, thick and silent, conceals the traces of human struggle beneath its soil. Visitors walk the same paths that once echoed with the footsteps of those fleeing death. They see the reconstructed huts, the remains of fire pits, and the small clearing where the camp's workshops once stood. Guides tell the story of the brothers who turned a forest into a haven, and of the 1,000 souls who found life there when the rest of the world offered none. As generations pass, the legacy of Tuvia, Zelzus, and Aaron Bielski endures not through monuments or books alone, but through the living descendants of those they saved. Across continents, families trace their lineage back to the forest of Naliboki, to the nights when hope survived in whispered prayers and quiet determination. The brothers' story stands as a chapter not only in Jewish history, but in the broader human story of endurance against tyranny. And though decades have dimmed the sounds of war and the voices of those who lived it, the forest still holds their memory. The trees that once sheltered them continue to rise, season after season, above the ground where courage once took root. In the years that followed, the story of the Bielski brothers faded quietly into the folds of history, remembered only by those who had walked with them through the shadows of the forest. But time, as it often does, began to unearth the buried echoes of the past. Survivors who had once been children in the camp grew older, their memories crystallizing into testimony. They spoke in classrooms, synagogues, and memorial halls, recalling the faces of those who had built homes beneath the trees. the smell of pine smoke that clung to the air, and the moments when life triumphed over despair. Each account added another layer to the collective remembrance of what had been achieved in the wilderness of Belarus. Historians traced the movement of the Belsa partisan unit through wartime archives and Soviet military reports, mapping their operations against the German occupation forces. They documented how the group sabotaged railways connecting Minsk to Lida, how they raided German supply depots, and how their intelligence reports aided Soviet offensives in 1943 and 1944. The Soviet government, though once suspicious of independent partisans, later acknowledged their contributions in regional records, noting the Bielski Otriad as one of the largest and most organized Jewish resistance formations in the occupied territories. As post-war generations sought to understand the scope of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, the Bielski story became a vital part of that history. Researchers uncovered evidence that the forest community had functioned almost entirely self-sufficiently, producing weapons, food, and clothing under the constant threat of discovery. Among the rescued were blacksmiths, teachers, doctors, and musicians whose skills helped sustain the group. Each trade became an act of defiance, each tool forged or loaf-baked a statement of survival. In the decades after their deaths, Tuvia and Zis were honored by Jewish organizations and Holocaust memorial institutions around the world. Their names were inscribed in museums and archives, their actions preserved in the oral histories of those they had saved. In Belarus, a stone memorial was raised near the site of the original camp, marking the place where over 1,000 lives had been reclaimed from the fires of destruction. The forest remains silent now, its canopy thick with the passage of time, but beneath the soil lie remnants of walls, ovens, and wells, a testament to human endurance built in secrecy and courage. As the 21st century unfolded, the story of the Bielski brothers reached a global audience. Films, documentaries, and historical studies reintroduced them to the world, transforming what had once been a forgotten chapter into one of the defining narratives of wartime resistance. Their legacy continues to be taught as part of Holocaust education, not as legend, but as documented history. The brothers who once led a hidden village in the depths of the Naliboki forest became symbols of a truth carved from survival. That even in a world consumed by darkness, the determination to protect life can light the way through the shadows of destruction.